All right. Hello, everyone. So I realized I wasn't actually letting you all know what I'm playing. So today, this is Float On by Modest Mouse, for those of you that were curious. And I see some daily UIs floating in. Awesome. If you have not posted them yet, please be sure to add them, and we'll save some extra time at the end of class to review them. Okay, so today we're going to dive into mobile design, but before we get started, I wanted to see if there were any questions related to the module that we reviewed yesterday, or any hiccups that you ran into your assignment that you'd like clarification or help on.
I have a few questions.
Sure.
So I I noticed that a lot of work is very manual. Is that how it is in like real world, or aren't we able to automate our solutions? We are, after all, working with technology. I mean, so I have only maybe a few wireframes that I have to manually adjust, but I would imagine that a real project would have hundreds. How do you take care of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in the beginning, it is going to feel very manual, whether it's using the design tool for the first time and not really taking full advantage of what how to use the design tool itself. So it will feel manual in the beginning. What tends to happen is as you gradually start to get more screens, what has been helpful for me is getting more and more familiar with the tool, but also just using as many shortcuts as I can and setting up my design tool so that I have master components set up. So that is supposed to make it a lot faster in terms of designing.
So I really wish that there was some sort of course dedicated to maybe learning all of those cool shortcuts or getting really good at Figma, because I feel like I have a lot of stuff piled in my to learn by myself list. Look up this, and you have shared an abundance of resources, which I haven't been able to go over. I feel like I'm going to forget all of that because I vaguely remember what you spoke about. I feel like those are more important things to focus on.
I have a thought about that. I mean, that
Mhm.
will definitely come with time. I've used complicated programs like Maya, Blender, 3ds Max that have insane buttons. Like there's thousands of them, really. And if you keep practicing, it will come natural. So if you worry about that now, don't really worry about that. It's just practice. You'll get faster. You'll get better. You'll know the shortcuts and everything.
I've also taken Ivan's advice on looking at a lot of YouTube videos of like any random tutorial in regards to Figma, and just look at them all the time. And if I have questions, just search it. If you really can't find something, message Figma and they will respond to you with how to do something, or if something is not right, they'll get back to you. They're really good with that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
It definitely takes time. I I've been teaching here since March, and I was primarily using Sketch even before I came here. And this is the first time I'm going through and using Figma. So I noticed there's a lot of similarities, which is really great. So a best practice for me is every time I'm doing something manually, I just take the extra step to say, is there a shortcut? And let me try to learn that. So that way that is part of what I'm able to take away and hopefully makes my process faster. So I'm with you. This is also a tool that I'm learning how to use as well. But with more and more practice, you're going to feel more confident and comfortable. And that goes for any tool. So whether you are working in a job where they're using Sketch, maybe they're using Adobe XD. I've worked in a role where we were using Balsamic and then we switched over to an entirely different design tool. That's just gradually how design teams work, just to focus on efficiency. So it'll take time. It'll take time, but the more that you practice, the stronger you'll become in the tool.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Send a link to Figma's YouTube channel, Evan. They have tons of tutorials.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gabe. Great. Other questions that I can answer? Okay. All right. So let's switch gears and talk about mobile design. And what we're going to review, if we take a look at Training Kit, is we're going to talk about differences between website, web apps, mobile apps, and desktop apps, how to design for mobile. Then we'll take a closer look at a high-level overview of the differences between iOS and Material Design. We'll dive into more so the components, and you'll also notice that a lot of the terminology is going to be, it might vary from what we saw yesterday. So in the event that you are creating an iOS or an Android app, you'll have a better understanding of this terminology when you're having conversations with your developer. Now, that being said, you are all working on web applications, so you do not need to worry about converting your existing Build Week projects over into a native mobile app design, but I do think that it's important just to illustrate the differences between the two and the different platforms or operating systems that you may be working on once you leave Lambda and become a UX designer. I have also shared in the Slack channel resources for the iOS Interface Essentials and Material Design Components. Similar to Bootstrap, we will not be able to go over every single piece, but these resources are here for you to refer back to. And these are design systems in themselves. They are constantly changing and evolving. And so one of the things that I really like to do is every year, there is a conference that's held by Apple, a conference that's held by Android, and not only will they talk about the latest devices that they're looking to launch, but they'll talk about the next operating system and changes that will take place, which would also influence the design. So sometimes there's been a whole rebrand, sometimes there are slight tweaks that they make in their design systems. So that's a really great area to stay on top of those trends. Okay. All right, so just to level set, there are 4 primary platforms that digital UX designers work with, and they are our websites, web apps, mobile apps, and desktop apps. And a good example that I have also available in Training Kit for you all to refer back to is a company that actually uses all 4, and that is Slack, which we all use every single day. The biggest difference between these platforms is that they're all going to have different design requirements, and they are developed differently from one another. So being able to understand these requirements and how to design for these contexts will help us create externally consistent user experiences. And this will allow us to join different design teams and immediately make an impact. Now, the first example that we'll take a look at are just websites. And if you've ever browsed the internet, then you're familiar with what a website is. Websites are static pieces of content that are accessed via web browsers like Google Chrome, Safari, Firefox, and they reside at a specific URL address, like we can see on the top here, which says slack.com. Websites are defined by their static, fixed nature. And while we commonly use the term website to describe all of our dynamic interactions on the web, in UX design, we make the distinction that websites are used for information consumption, while web apps are more interactive experiences. And we'll talk about web apps in just a bit. So that being said, examples of websites, they can include news sites, blogs, marketing websites. So here is an example of Slack's landing page, their marketing website. It's pretty static, where there's just a bunch of content that is illustrating the special features of Slack, and there's not that much interactivity. As we design for websites, it's important that we emphasize information sent, meaning being able to predict or help users predict what they'll be able to find when they pursue a certain path through a website. It's also important to emphasize text hierarchy, a principle that we talked about last week. So we see that a lot in this marketing landing page, where the UVP is highlighted much bigger in comparison to the subtitle text. And then we have our call to action that stands right out where it says try Slack. And also making sure that our website's information architecture is set up so that the user can consume content and be able to find what they need.
I'm not sure if this is the way you want it displayed, but I see your screen, and then I also see a bunch of notes on the left. Is that how it's supposed to be?
Oh, no, it's not supposed to. Thank you, Serena.
I was trying to find what details you were talking about. I couldn't find them.
This is what I was trying to show. Can you all see this?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. All right, so this is what I was actually referring to. So just to point out a couple of things that I mentioned earlier, the website itself, as you can see, it doesn't have a whole lot of interactivity. This is Slack's marketing landing page, not the one that you were looking at previously. And so they focus on text hierarchy, a clear call to action. Here's the URL that we all are familiar with that you can see here. And so it's a pretty static page in comparison to what you were just all looking at, which is this. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But this is going to be what we call a website. And let me switch gears and show you a couple of other examples. So here we have Buffer. These links are also available in Training Kit for you to refer back to. But in Buffer, here is a pretty static website where it's just a bunch of content that's shown. So here are all of the blogs and articles that are posted. And if we take a look at another example, we have InVision. Again, more so blog content that is generated here that we're able to easily go in and view and take a look at and read. So not as much interactivity, not a lot of interaction that's taking place, more so us just viewing the content that we see in front of us. And then one more example, this can also relate to news sites like we just talked about. So here's bbc.com. Here we're just purely digesting the content that we see in front of us. So this is how we would define what a website is. Questions on websites?
What about shopping websites? Would you consider those static or interactive?
Let's take a look at one. Let's go to Warby Parker. So Warby Parker, if you're not familiar, is a glasses shop. And where it could get a little complicated is sometimes websites and web apps. Web apps are defined by having a lot of interactivity. Sometimes it could be a mix of the two. So it could be really difficult to define and say this is a website or this is a web app. So for a shopping website like this, where I'm able to go in and let's say I'm shopping for a pair of glasses and I'm searching through and I'm selecting which ones I might be interested in, I would consider this more of a web application just because I'm able to go in and filter for specific things that I'm looking for. It's less about just digesting what's in front of me, but there's actual steps that I need to take in order to go through the shopping experience.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Other questions on websites? Okay. All right, so let's move on to web apps. All right, so here's an example of a web app. And web apps, like Slack, can actually be accessed through the web browser on the internet, and they live on a specific URL. So here we see in the previous version for website, we saw slack.com, and in here we see app.slack.com. So these web apps are not actual apps that you would download, for instance, from iTunes or the Play Store. And we use the term web app to distinguish this from static websites from the interaction-heavy experiences. So I keep referring back to this this verb interactivity. So web apps are going to be defined by their interactivity, and they'll typically incorporate a lot of different types of actions, user feedback, interaction design patterns that we were all looking through yesterday. And so that users can gain additional value through their experience. And examples of web apps that you all may have used in the past can include Facebook, Google Docs, InVision in terms of the prototyping tool. And it's made to feel like these experiences have been downloaded as applications on your phone. And I touched on this a little bit earlier, but the challenging piece is that web apps and websites, they can contain elements of both static and interactivity. So for example, if we look at, let me switch over to InVision. If we look at InVision, they actually have their own marketing or their own static website. But at the same time, InVision also has a web app, as we can see within their prototyping tool, where we can go in and view prototypes, add prototypes, collaborate with other folks. So there may be instances where a blog might be a website because it shares static content, like we saw with the InVision blog. But it could have a dynamic comment system that acts more like a web app. So it could contain elements of both. So basically, we tend to use the term website to refer to any experience that's accessed on the web. And in practice, we tend to say that a web app lives on a website, or we make the distinction that the website is a web app itself. So basically, to be able to determine the differences between a web app and a website is to look at its content and to look at its experience. If things feel pretty static, like we were just looking at before with Slack's marketing landing page, then that experience is going to fall more of a website. And then if there's a lot of user interaction, like we can see here in Slack in this browser experience, then we're going to consider this as a web app. So as we design for web applications, we need to ensure that we're emphasizing for interaction design so that our users can input appropriate information into the system to extract its value as output. So we just took a look at InVision as an example. Another example of a web app is Airbnb, where it's not just purely static screens. There's the ability for us to go in and search for a particular place that we would like to travel to. So let's say we were going to Paris and it was just myself. I could go in, search for experiences, search for things that I would like to do while I'm in Paris, go in, interact with it a few more by being able to read its content, but then being able to book an actual event if I were interested in this particular experience that I had selected. So this is another example of a web application. Other ones that you also may have interacted with in the past is Twitter. Twitter also has a web app, and therefore being able to update your status or comment or like other people's posts, that is also a form of a web application. So what questions do we have about web apps?
So I'm trying to find or figure out really what the main difference is between a website and a web application. So the web application is where it's immediately synced to a mobile app, or is that?
So I would define it as how you're able to consume the content. So for a website, it's going to be more static where you're purely, for example, just reading the content, whereas a web app is going to provide more interaction where you can actually go in and physically enter information in text input fields and generate information. So thinking of the example that we used for Warby Parker, I'm able to go in and find what I'm looking for rather than just viewing a static screen and digesting it. But a web app can also be in a desktop form that you see here or in a mobile form.
Okay, so to clarify, the Warby Parker was a web app example.
Yes.
Okay. And what about Medium? Medium.com.
Yeah, so that is an example where it could be a mixture between two. So if I were to go to medium.com, here, if we were just purely looking for information, I would view this more as a website in itself. But then as we get further into what we see in front of here, there is some interactivity where you're able to add claps, or maybe you're a Medium writer yourself where you're creating content. That would be, in that aspect, that would be a web app. So for this, I would say it would be like a blend between the two,
Okay.
depending on how you're looking at it.
Okay, because literally that's what I thought. I was like, well, Medium is both.
Yeah.
So, okay, so you can have
Nowadays, there's really not a lot of websites out there
that do this, right?
because most of the websites that I know, I mean, you can log in and sign up and do stuff. So websites, what do you think would be a good example of a pure website instead of a web app?
Would it be some personal blog?
Yeah, I would prefer more to news articles and blogs as websites, or marketing landing pages are a really good example of that.
So a company that like Slack, who has everything, why, for example, would they choose to have a static website and a web app?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a really good question. So if we think of, and we can refer back to Slack as an example, they may want to have it set up where they're focused on having a marketing landing page so it's a point where users can come in and learn more about the product. And then they may have a web application like Slack in itself where it's the actual product itself where users are able to go in and chat with other users. So it's going to be dependent on use cases. You're going to see a lot of products out there that is going to touch upon perhaps even all 4 platforms, but they're all going to solve different needs. Does that answer your question, Nora? Oh, I don't know if you're muted.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, sure.
I was just going through the Slack website to see what they have, but I guess you can refer to them as marketing landing pages.
Yeah, I would say this would be purely static. Gabe, were you going to say something?
Yeah, if I can add, because marketing, like static websites, are easier to optimize for SEO, but web apps are harder for Google to crawl for SEO purposes. So
Awesome.
most apps like have separate ones. So if you like sometimes if you try to log in from a static website, it will redirect you to their app or to their web app.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Other questions on websites or web apps? All right. Okay, so the third platform are desktop apps. And desktop apps are pieces of software that we run directly on our computer. And since they're installed directly on a computer, they can take advantage of additional computing resources to enable more complicated user experiences. Prior to the rise of modern web browsers and faster internet speeds, desktop apps were the primary digital product experiences. And continuing on with this Slack theme that we have here, Slack also has a desktop application that you're able to download on your computer, which we see as an example here. And other examples that you may all have used in the past, Sketch. Sketch is a desktop app that you can also download. Other resources like Keynote. Keynote is also a desktop app, which you see right in front of you, that you're able to use as well. And I was going to go through one more example, but I'm going to end up giving the answer for the in-class challenge. So these are 2 examples with desktop applications. What questions do we have about desktop apps?
Just that person needs to read the messages. Some unread messages.
I am guilty of that. So there is a Slack channel called Designer Hangout, if any of you are interested in checking it out, but it's literally just all resources for designers. And as you can tell, I have not gone in here for a really long time. So yeah, but I thought this was a really good example to show you all without showcasing anything else, because as you can see, I haven't interacted with it quite too much. Other questions or comments on desktop apps? Okay. All right. And then finally, our 4th platform we have are called mobile apps. And you might hear me interchangeably use native apps, but mobile/native apps are pieces of software that can only run on your mobile devices. So think of them as applications that you use for your iPhone or Android phone. At some point, you went to the App Store or you went to Google Play, the Google Play Store, to download an application so that it was easier for you to be able to do things on the go. And unlike websites that link to other websites or web apps, mobile apps tend to be self-contained units that accomplish a specific task. We refer to them as apps because they typically involve a high level of interactivity. As we design these experiences, we can utilize our mobile apps hardware to enhance our users' interactions. To do so, we'll need to make sure we can collaborate closely with our developer counterparts to understand what's feasible and focus on our interaction design. So because we're all working on web apps for Build Week, you will not be building out an actual native mobile application. But the example that we have in front of us is an app that I've downloaded from the Google Play Store, which is Slack. And one of the things that we just touched on is you're able to utilize your mobile apps. You're basically able to utilize your phone's hardware to enhance the user interaction. And what we mean by that is if you've ever used an application such as Uber, Uber's automatically able to auto-detect your location, so that way your Uber driver will be able to find you so that they can pick you up. Other instances are applications where they use the microphone, for example, that is also utilizing the phone's hardware. So those are extra things that you'll be able to take advantage of with a device in itself when you're building out your experience. Since I do not have a phone hooked up, we can just reference some examples in the App Store and Google Play Store. But here, anything that you would find under the App Store would be considered a mobile app or native app. And in this example, we have Uber. Questions? Okay. All right. We are going to do an in-class challenge. And so we're going to take 5 minutes just to review Figma and just list out what are the different platforms that Figma uses. All right, so that's been uploaded into Slack channel. And so just as a reminder, different platforms that we have are our websites, our web apps, our desktop apps, and our mobile apps. And if you need to refer back to Training Kit, that is all there. But let's spend 5 minutes to review Figma. What are the different platforms that Figma uses?
Sorry, when you say that Figma uses, do you mean the different platforms that you can design for on Figma, or the different platforms you can access Figma on?
The different platforms that you can access Figma on.
Okay.
Thanks for the clarification. Other questions related to the challenge? All right, cool. So I'll just put 5 minutes, play some music.
think you're muted, Melissa.
Thank you, Brandon. All right, so what did we come up with?
I mean, there's live previews on both Android and iOS, and then the editor in both Windows and Mac. Also, you can do it online.
Awesome. So they have native applications or mobile apps. What else?
They also have desktop apps, and I guess it's a web app because you can also work on it through web. And it also has a website,
Yeah,
so it has all.
it has all. It has all. Yeah, so if we take a look, what we have been working a lot on, the examples that I've been showing you in Figma, I've just been using a web app. So they do have a desktop app. They have the Mirror app that's available in the store for you to download. And if we look at Figma, I might need to go. Oh, there we go. Let's see if I can get out of this login. All right, and they have a website as well. So this is their marketing landing page. So we can see the biggest difference between this and the web app, as this is purely content that we're just digesting versus the web application like this, where there's more interactions that are taking place.
So do they have an app? Because when I went to the App Store to try and download it, it was just the Mirror, which is completely different than what they do. It's like I can't design on my phone.
Yeah.
I wish you could design in your phone or your iPad. That'd be amazing.
No, but if you want to make changes to something, right? It's like I was just looking at my Mirror and I'm like, oh, this button needs to be a little bit bigger. But yeah, it's like almost completely different product.
Yeah, it is.
People are smart because I've tried accessing the Figma web app through my iPad, but I have to trick it and have it like a desktop view, and it goes into the file and everything, but I can't interact with anything. Like the only thing I can touch is the assets on the left, and it will highlight it, but I cannot touch, edit, nothing. I'm like, oh my God, I was so close.
I actually saw a friend of mine, she got one of those sticky things for basically to hold your phone into the car, but she stuck it to her desk, and that's how she keeps the phone mounted, and she's working on her computer next to her to see how it translates, because it translates immediately. As soon as you're moving stuff, you can see it on the phone next to you. Super smart.
Yeah, I think they have those mounts. I purchased one a year ago because I was having, it wasn't so much a difficulty, but more of a convenience, where I was working in Sketch, because Sketch has a similar version, and I kept picking up my phone, and I'd rather just have it right next to me. So they're probably like $5 or $10 on Amazon if you're interested in purchasing one. Cool. So to Nora's point earlier, yes, so this particular, what we see in front of us, Figma Mirror, isn't exactly doesn't contain the same features that we would have in a web app or in their desktop app. But the point that to highlight here is that Figma does offer a native application, which is Figma Mirror, but they do have a native app under their platforms that they have. All right, other questions about the exercise that we've just completed, or the differences between all four of these platforms?
In the work field, are they very specific in the language that they're using when they're referring to all of these?
In my experience, no.
Okay.
I've just used websites, mobile screens, desktop screens. So I have not been very specific, or have heard other folks being very specific.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay, so let's move on to the next piece. We're going to talk about the 4 principles of mobile design. So switching gears, and now that we have a better understanding between all 4 of these platforms, let's talk about how we can design for mobile. And we think about designing for mobile, it should align with how users are interacting with their devices. So these are 4 principles that I've pulled from Luke Wroblewski's book, which is called Mobile First. And he outlines 4 principles as to how mobile web experiences should be organized. The first is making sure that it aligns with mobile behaviors. The second is emphasizing content over navigation. Third is providing relevant options for exploration. And lastly, making sure that we maintain clarity and focus. So let's take a look at each of this and get more detailed as to what we mean by each principle. All right, so this first principle that he outlines, aligning with mobile behaviors. Designing for mobile is going to have its own set of limitations compared to designing for a desktop experience. And one of the ways that we can account for this is understanding how an individual interacts with their mobile devices. So typically, users generally interact with their mobile devices in 4 ways. The first one is to look up or find something. For example, the user needs to find an answer to something. Let's say you're traveling in the middle of the world and you're unsure of how to get to your next destination, or maybe you forgot to pack something on your trip and you need to find it at a local store. You would use perhaps maybe a Google Maps search option to try to find the closest location or closest store where you could purchase your items. The next one is explore or play. This is when the user has additional time on their hands and they're looking for a distraction. And things that come to mind when it comes to exploring or playing, perhaps many of you have played Candy Crush in the past, where there's games that are very addictive and a good distraction of time. Or for example, people who are using social media sites like Twitter, Instagram, where they're continuing to scroll just because they have extra time and they're continuing to explore to see what other people are doing in their lives. The third mobile behavior is check-in or status. This is when an individual wants to stay on top of something that keeps changing or updating. So one example that comes to mind is checking your flight status. That may be an example as to checking in and staying informed as to what is going to take place or whether your plane is delayed or any changes that may come up. And then we have edit or create, our 4th principle. This is when the user needs to get something done now. And examples that come to mind are checklists that you may have on your phone, for example, Google Keep, or maybe you are creating a calendar invite to set a reminder for something that you need to do with a friend or family member the following day. So these are just general behavioral guidelines that we can use when we think about how users interact with mobile devices. And we can use these guidelines to structure how our mobile experiences so that we're able to meet our users' goals. What questions do we have about aligning with mobile behaviors?
Would tablets follow the same principles as phones in this case?
So the answer to that is I would say yes, just because tablets themselves are portable devices that you may also have with you. So when it comes to designing, you always want to design in context. So I would find that these would be applicable in that type of experience as well.
Okay.
Other questions about these principles? So moving on to the second principle, which is emphasizing content over navigation. And we talked a lot about this last week in separate modules, but as we know, content comes first when it comes to creating experiences. It's not going into our design tool and coming up with the screen from scratch. It's identifying what content is going to live in our experience before we actually define how the user is going to be able to interact with it. So with the second general guideline, that content precedes navigation, when it comes to designing any experience, whether it's on mobile, whether it's desktop, whether it comes to designing for tiny smartwatches, focusing on content is going to be very important. So if we think back to the module last week, and this was related to, I think this was related to the module to topography, we had this Epicurrence, this beautiful Epicurrence website that appeared, but there wasn't any content. At that point, it just looked like a beautiful picture. So when it comes to designing content first, that is because when users come to your website, they are looking for something. So just remember that content is going to precede navigation. Questions on the second principle? All right, the third principle is providing relevant options for exploration. So allowing users to easily find what they're looking for. This means that when we're creating a navigation experience, that this needs to be logical for the user. For example, allowing the user to easily pivot and find what they're looking for. Good examples of this is sometimes we see a shortcut on the top navigation bar to allow the user to easily move from screen to screen. Or perhaps maybe there's a tabbed bar experience, so similar to Facebook, where they have all these different sections that a user can easily navigate to. I think we touched on this yesterday too, we talked about optimal sort. I might be butchering the name. I know Kyla posted it in the Slack channel, but understanding the terminology that your users will use when it comes to searching for things on your site, that is a really, really great exercise, just card sorting in general, to align with what they're looking for so that you're using the same terminology. Questions on this third principle? Okay, and then our final principle that we have is maintaining clarity and focus, allowing users to focus on a specific task at hand. I always talk about designing for the context, in the context of your users. For example, we'll never know what our user is doing while they're using our product. Perhaps they're sitting on their couch watching TV, or maybe they're running on the treadmill, which has happened to me. I'm responding Slack messages to Lambda students or Lambda instructors. So when designing for mobile, we have to take into account the level of distraction that could take place. Therefore, it's going to be important that we're maintaining clarity and focus. And a good example is shown with Gmail's application, where their compose screen is focusing on one specific task at hand. It's not a screen where we see everything else that would take place, like the incoming messages or the sent messages. There's one task at hand that the user will need to complete. What questions do we have about focusing on a specific task at hand? And just to add to this, one of the things that I was really guilty of early in my UX career is trying to fit everything within a mobile screen. And sometimes I would end up with a screen that was just overly detailed, and there were so many things that could take place that could really confuse the user. So, you know, at the end of this module, when you're working on your assignments, look at your experiences that you've built out, especially in mobile. If there are a bunch of tasks that you're asking the users to complete, that might create a sense of, that might make the user feel a little overwhelmed, not quite sure where to start or where to begin. So make sure that you take a look and see that we're really focusing on one thing hopefully at a time, so that way we can make it easier for our user to complete a particular task. Okay. All right, so we just went over the 4 principles of mobile design, and to go along with designing for mobile, one aspect that I'd like to talk about is also making sure that we're designing for touch. So that is how our users are going to interact with our mobile devices. Completely different experience as if they were interacting with your product via their computers. As a result, we really need to make sure that we make this easy for our users when they're interacting with mobile experiences. And this is really all about how to design for touch in terms of the specific sizes that we should use in our mockups. It's really, really easy to make things smaller when we're designing for mobile, but this is when we want to focus on things like our buttons to be a little bit bigger. And there's general guidelines that we can follow when it comes to optimizing for touch targets. The first is MIT's Touch Lab. They suggest a 10 to 14 millimeter for finger pads and 8 to 10 millimeter for fingertips. So just to help level set what we mean by millimeters, if you look at your keypad, most keypads are around 15 millimeters. What MIT is suggesting for fingertips is between 8 to 10 millimeters, so a little bit smaller than what you see in front of you. Another way to approach this, which is much easier to follow, is that Apple recommends a minimum of 44 pixels tall. So in all examples that we've been working on, you've all have practiced this. We have been using this 44 pixels. And then if you are working with Android, Android does recommend a minimum of 48 pixels tall. There may be other mobile interfaces that you see out there where it's a little bit smaller. My rule of thumb is continue to test your screens on your device. And so I think it was Nora that brought this up earlier. She noticed on her phone that there was a button that was a little too small or a little too big that she had to adjust for. So there are rules out there, but the best thing that you can do is download Figma Mirror and take a look at your screens. And as you're prototyping them out, make sure that those touch targets are tappable. Another thing to also be mindful of is that since we're interacting with our mobile devices, our fingers are naturally going to fall towards the end of our mobile devices. So when we are creating buttons, where we're creating actions, we should place them where our users will naturally place their thumb or index fingers. And by taking a look at your assignments, I think all of us have done a really nice job. I'm just making sure that that has been aligned with what we're just reviewing right now. All right. And then this last one here is designing for basic touch gestures. So this really falls with material design and iOS human interface guidelines. You'll see between these two devices that there are going to be differences in gestures between these platforms. You also may notice differences in these touch gestures if somebody were to use a Windows device or a completely other different type of operating system. So my recommendation is if you are at the point where you are working with a developer and you're designing for iOS, there is a basic touch gestures guide that they have available, and we should take them into consideration just so we can also align with how the user is interacting with the device itself. Questions on designing for touch?
Would it be a good idea for certain buttons and actions to have in the settings something like left-hand holder, right-hand holder? Because I know I am a left-hand holder for the phone. I do everything with my left hand, but I do know people that do it with the right hand. For example, in my food passport, on the search button, it's on the bottom right corner. So for the right hand people, it would be pretty weird and hard to get it. But for the left hand people, it would be pretty easy.
My question for that would be how many users would find that valuable and whether it's worth the effort to build out. That would always be a research question in itself. So I don't have an answer. It would be a general question that you could ask.
Okay. Okay.
I have another question.
Sure.
So, how do you design for? I've noticed certain apps, like I have an Android, and if I shake it, it does something, or if I flip it, so it's I don't know what the technical word for that is, but how do you design for those? Is that something you consider at all?
Yeah. So depending on device, they're going to have their own set of rules. So what I would refer to is if I were to do, let's see, material.io, there's a whole guide related to gestures where they even show the do's and don'ts. And what I would do in this case is get familiar with what is shown here. And then once I get into designing, I would be familiar with this and ensure that it follows along the principles that material design has laid out. They will have specific terminology for gestures. So if you go into types of gestures, that's where you can go in and find a specific word for it.
I had a question back to the 4 principles of mobile design. The content over navigation. Do you have a visual example for me to understand this a little bit more?
A visual that I could refer back to, and it's like a very simplified version of it, is just defining what your content is supposed to look like. So let me actually pull up Figma. And I think we did this with the sign in or sign up page for Flutter. What was it? Or actually, we could use this. And so what I mean by content preceding navigation is before we even start plopping things on this page here, we need to come up basically like what are our product requirements, what are we prioritizing before we even move it over to this page. So this is like a very simplified version of, okay, we talked about wanting to have all of this, we've prioritized it, and we feel that the most important information to the user is going to have this navigation, a hero section, and a section dedicated to other services. And so that would be an example of prioritizing content first before we get into navigation, thinking through how the user is going to interact with the product.
Interesting. So when you say navigation, does that also include information architecture?
Yes.
Okay.
Because if we were to try to think about doing it the other way around, if we were to just come up with our information architecture, that might be more challenging if we don't know what content we want to present to our user.
Okay. So when we do our brainstorming and we're coming up with all these features that we want to have within a certain product, that relates to content first.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And that will normally come with a product brief or product requirements that you've received. So thinking back to what you all signed up for Build Week, I took a look at the spreadsheet. That would be almost the product description, the product requirements. And once that's laid out, then you're able to go in and start taking a deeper dive into what like the information architecture is going to look like.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
I have a quick question. You mentioned that button sizes differs between Android and iOS, but what if you're designing an app from scratch and it kind of needs to fit everything, and then you just give it to an iOS developer and then Android developer to do it? Do you have to design like 2 different versions? I've
Yes.
never owned an Android either, so I don't actually know what it looks like.
Yeah, we'll go through material design for the second half of the lesson, and you all will actually get to practice with material design. But yes, in most cases, when you have an application that's available in both in the App Store and in Google Play, you will need to design for both. And it's better to do that than to leave it up to the developer. Just because they'll have something that they can refer back to, and it's going to truly match the mock-up that you've put together.
Thank you.
Okay.
To follow up on that question, is that when we start to dive deeper into responsive design versus adaptive design?
So that is going to be related to the web applications that you'll be building out.
Okay.
And we're going to talk about responsive design tomorrow. So yes, when you're designing responsively, there are different screen sizes that you will need to account for, that you'll need to build out. That is going to be a continuous conversation that you have with your developer, just because what we've been trying to get away with responsive design is by designing by screen size. What you should be creating should be fluid across all different design sizes.
Yeah.
Or mobile device sizes.
All right. Thank you.
Sorry. All right. Great questions, everyone. Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll dive into iOS and material design. right, welcome back. I realized I hadn't started the timer, so some of you, we may have had some extra minutes, which was totally fine. Okay, so up until this point, we've reviewed the 4 different platforms. We've talked about how to design for mobile by aligning with mobile behaviors. And now we're going to take a look at iOS interface guidelines and material design. And all of you are building out web applications for Build Week. So this will not apply to your Build Week project, but this is going to be applicable so that if you are ever designing for a completely different operating system, you'll have that terminology under your belt so that you're better able to communicate with your developer. Yesterday, we took a look at design systems, and what we're about to review are another set of design systems that Apple and Google have put together. As a reminder, we have design systems so that when we are creating our user interfaces, we're able to create a consistent and excellent user interface. And at this point, we can take a closer look at iOS Human Interface. So the iOS Human Interface Guidelines is Apple's design system. They use very specific application patterns that provide additional guidance about the design principles to follow in order to create a consistent user experience. And by providing these guidelines, Apple is trying to improve upon the quality of its apps on its mobile platforms so that they maintain a reputation for quality. While we could disregard their advice for a compelling research-backed reason, we'll almost always want to follow their design system. That way we'll deliver an experience that users will quickly adopt and thrive in. For iOS, we'll focus on their interface essentials, which are basically their components. And we'll focus on a few within these categories, but being able to use and understand these elements will help us achieve a consistent appearance across our app's experience. And these 3 categories that we have are bars, views, and controls. So let us switch over and take a look at the interface guidelines. And this link is not only available in TradingKit, but this is also posted in the Slack channel so that if you'd like to follow along and take a look at other components at the same time, you are free to do that. So in terms of interface essentials, iOS has it broken down into these 3 categories. We'll first go and talk about bars. So bars are going to tell the users where they are in an application. These examples could be buttons or other elements that initiate action and communicate information. Examples of bars could be navigation bars, search bars, tab bars, and let's take a look at a few of them in detail. The navigation bar, which is a common terminology that we've seen in the Bootstrap components, are what we see that's on the top of the screen. So this would live underneath the status bar that we see here. In iOS design, there's typically a back button, which lets the user go back 1 screen. And then on the right-hand side, sometimes you also see additional buttons such as edit or done that lives on the right-hand side of the navigation bar. With that, sometimes navigation bars also have titles to let the user know where they are. And it's typically a good practice not to try to overcrowd the navigation bar with too much information. Questions on navigation bars in iOS?
So these elements you wouldn't put for web app design, right? You just do it when you're doing a native iPhone app?
Yes, yes. So I'm happy that you brought that up. So these components that we're talking about, these are specific right now what we're reviewing is specific to Apple. We are not creating Apple native mobile applications, so these components, this same look and feel, or this exact component would not live in your web application.
Okay.
All right, so the next, under this bars category, the next one are search bars that we see frequently in iOS native applications. And these search bars, they can typically be displayed alone like we see here, or they could reside in the navigation bar. If we continue to scroll down, most of these navigation bars, they include additional context. So here we can kind of see where it says search photos. And there's also a clear button that populates as well, or a cancel button. Questions on search bars in iOS? Okay. And then tab bars. These are also a common element that appear in iOS, and these typically appear or do appear on the bottom of an application. This is to help the user access many different sections of the app. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you add too many tabs, it's actually going to reduce the tappable amount of the area. So a good rule of thumb is to keep the number of icons on the bottom between 3 to 5. Also, take a look at how they're using their iconography. The icons that they're using, they're visually consistent and balanced with one another. Questions on tab bars? All right, so the next category that we'll look into are called views. And views are content that users will see in the app itself. This can include things like text, graphics. They can also include interactive elements. And a common one that uses the same terminology that we were looking at before from yesterday's module are called alerts. So alerts are going to be important pieces of information that normally contain a title, some text, and a button. And again, similar to what we discussed yesterday, alerts are not to be used frequently because they can be disruptive to the experience. Also keep in mind that the copy that's used in alerts needs to be concise and easy to understand. Questions on alerts? All right. And then under views, we have tables. So think of tables as just a bunch of rows, a list of rows, and they can be labeled by section or displayed in groups. So here's one where we have it by label. Here's one where we have it broken out by group. And in this case, a good best practice is to make sure that we're not making our tables too small or too large, which will make the content difficult to read. Questions on tables? All right. So let's move on to our final category, which is controls. Controls are going to allow the user to take action. And if we look at buttons, there's a bunch of different types of terminology that they use for buttons. But most commonly, we have here a system button. These typically appear in the navigation bar. And as you can see here, they have send highlighted. So a really a good best practice is to keep these verbs short so that it doesn't overcrowd the interface. Other buttons that I'll just point out, so sometimes we call this an info button. This is called a detailed disclosure button. And then here we have a info button. So this is a really good example of just making sure that when we're chatting with our developers that we're referring back to this guideline and we're able to distinguish the differences between these. You're not going to remember or memorize every single piece. When I was working on iOS and Android applications, I had to, from time to time, go back. And also, design systems are constantly updating, so the terminology may change as well. So it's always good to take a look and see and read the document from time to time. All right, so moving on, we have pickers. And pickers are going to be a scrollable list of values. For example, they're commonly used when it comes to editing a calendar. And the way that this should be structured is that the values should be ordered logically. It should not be tedious to navigate through this experience. Questions on pickers? And then we have our progress indicators, which we're looking at, which were called spinners yesterday. So progress indicators are just letting us know that the page is loading. And iOS will typically use this iconography to let us know that items are loading in the background. For example, this update. Questions on progress indicators? Okay. Then this next item is what in iOS we call switches. They are essentially just toggles that represent an on and off state. And they're intended to be used in the form of a table like we see here. So here are tables that we were just reviewing. Typically with switches, there's not a label that's associated with this. So oftentimes in toggles, maybe we see an off or on. They're purely text-free. Questions on switches? All right. And then finally, under this controls category, we have text fields that we all have been working with, but this would be instead of using text input field, they would just be called text fields in iOS. And this is used when small amounts of information is requested. Typically in text fields, if you could see faintly here, they also contain placeholder text to help the user understand its purpose. Questions on text fields? All right, questions in general about any of the components or interface essentials that we've reviewed?
So these examples are all for native apps only.
Exactly. And so if we look at the human interface guidelines at like a higher level, they have guidelines for a bunch of different types of devices. They'll have their own for their watches or for their Mac operating system, but the ones that we focus on are purely for their smartphone devices or tablets.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Yeah, at least for iOS, every single phone will use the same thing. For Android, you got Samsung, HTC, Motorola. Oh my God.
yeah.
Nightmare.
It is, and it's funny that you brought that up. Part of my job at Verizon was working with all of these different manufacturers to try to make sure that it was consistent across all of these devices. But they have their own version where they're customizing the colors. They might customize a few buttons. So with iPhones, everything will feel cohesive. With Androids, you're definitely going to see a difference between multiple devices.
So even with manufacturers, there's a difference, because I thought that if you have an Android operating system, whether it's like the Jelly Bean versus does that make a difference?
No, so their operating system is going to be they're still going to follow the same operating system like Jelly Bean or Marshmallow, but in terms of what the design is going to look like to the user, they might add slight customizations to it. And so we can talk more about the components for that.
They're very different from each other. Like Samsung really has the easiest one to use. Motorola, I mean, the menu, nothing really looks alike. Even the settings on top, the setting menu, nothing looks alike.
They're
So-
more.
Sorry, go ahead.
Nope, go on, Serena.
So for example, when you were working in Verizon, obviously you have, I don't know how many different manufacturers which have a list of different phone models. You had to create designs for practically the most popular ones, all of them?
Not designs. Something as simple as think of the settings on your phone, which would be an exact replica across all iPhones. The settings in itself could be different, ranging from like a Motorola device to a Samsung device. And so it was maintaining structure in that and making sure that if a Samsung user were to try to find Wi-Fi settings, that it would be in the same location as if they were to use a Motorola device.
Okay. I'm not totally wrapping my brain around that, but maybe I'll do some more investigating in that. Okay.
Yeah. The key takeaway is Android can be more customizable. With Apple, they're a bit stricter in terms of their user interface. They require that when you submit your app, that it actually goes under review. Android is less strict. So there's more customization and flexibility.
Okay.
All right, so let's actually talk about material design. And material design was a design system that launched a few years ago, back in 2014. And this system is built by Google. So everything that you see here supports their best practices of user interface design. And when we use material design, we'll typically use these designs to design Android applications. So a quote from material design: material design is a visual language that synthesizes the classic principles of good design with the innovation of technology and science. So the components that we'll be taking a look at are designed in a way based on how users perceive things in the real world. For example, if you're familiar with Gmail, Google Drive, or any other Google product that you've used, you have seen material design in action. While the material design guidelines do focus on the big picture design considerations, they have an extensive pattern library and various tools to help implement material design. And one of the tools that we'll take a look at is their UI kit, which is available in Figma. So being able to leverage these assets, they help us complete our Android designs faster and also maintains an external consistency. And with any mobile application that we're designing, we'll frequently want to view these guidelines in order to help us understand when to use particular patterns, or when there's a time where we may need to actually develop our own design. Okay, so let's take a look at its components. Here I'm at materials.io. There are a ton of resources here that I recommend that you all take a look at. They even have their own color generator tool. We'll talk more about responsive layout grids tomorrow, but they even have things as far as having their own sound design system. So there's a lot of good stuff here. What we're primarily going to focus on are just the components and again, understanding the terminology so we have that common ground with our developers. And we'll go through a few that are the most common. Let's start with app bars. So app bars.
Website, I use this a lot.
Good. So we'll practice building out some of our screens today. But if you are ever stuck, for example, you don't know how to make a particular button from scratch, use this as design inspiration, or use a color palette if you're stuck with that. All right, so app bars. App bars are going to be similar to a navigation bar. It's just named differently, but this is going to display information related to the screen. They'll typically have a hamburger menu, what we call on the left-hand side, and then also a page title, as well as some actions that appear on the right-hand side of the screen. Related to app bars, we have bottom bars, which I think is relatively new. My preference is that if you are going to implement an app bar, I would actually have you start with the top app bar. I am not too familiar with many applications that have a hamburger menu on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Regardless, this is still a good component to be aware of. So basically with these bottom bars, the navigation's on the far left and the actions are on the right-hand side of the screen. This is going to be contextual to the screen that you're on. Questions on app bars? Okay, so then we'll, oh.
Would you put an app bar, a bottom app bar on a web app or mobile?
So the way that material design is structured, it doesn't have to be specific to mobile apps. If you're designing a desktop experience or a web app, these components can also be applicable to that. Does that answer your question, Ivan?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Cool. So here we have our bottom navigation, which was very familiar to what we had seen with iOS, where they had a tab bar. This is called a bottom nav or bottom navigation. And this is allowing the users to view the top level sections of the application. And normally it would hold between 3 to 5. Material design does suggest that if you are using a bottom navigation, that you should be pairing your icons with these text labels like we see here. Questions on bottom navigations? All right, buttons. So buttons, these are going to allow the user to take action. And in this case, the material design actually uses all caps for their buttons. And if we take a look here, what's really great about this particular design system is you can go in and explore different options. So they can appear as filled. There's also outline and text only. Questions on buttons? All right, here, and you can also add icons. All right. Then we have cards. This is going to present content with actions. So they're typically made up with content blocks that include an image, a title, or supporting text. And I think we went through this yesterday. So this is something that you could also take a look at and play around with. Cards can be set up in multiple different ways, a very flexible component that you can use. Questions on cards? All right. Then we have dialogues. Dialogues are going to be the important pieces of information that are displayed to the user. So if we think back to iOS, we were calling them alerts. In material design, they're called dialogues, and they can come in multiple forms. So in this example, we have, let's see, we have this alert. A dialogue can also be a list of options that appear. And then actually, there's also confirmation where they have a list of options and actions that you can take. But typically in a dialogue, it would contain a title, some text, and a button. Questions on dialogues? All right. The next one is a navigation drawer. And this is going to provide access to sections of your application. So whereas when we're taking a look at the bottom navigation, this is normally going to reflect the top level sections that users can easily access. But when it comes to navigation drawers, these will typically showcase items that may be unrelated to your app experience. So sometimes you'll see settings that are placed here. In this example, I believe this is, it could be related to Google Drive, where they have other options that are listed that the user may not necessarily need to get to right away. Questions on navigation drawers? All right, and then progress indicators. So we've seen the same terminology that's used across iOS and material design. And again, it's just providing that status. So there's multiple ways that progress indicators can appear to a user. One, it can appear linear, like we see here. There's also a circular view, and these are examples that we also pulled from yesterday. Questions on progress indicators? All right. And then lastly, we have text fields. And so in this example, text fields, as we know, this is going to allow the user to enter and edit their information. And in material design's case, they come in filled and they come in outlined. There's also additional options that you could add. So related to character count, if you have a form field, for example, sometimes there might be an additional, what they call a icon, leading icon, or a trailing icon. And so there's different variations that we'll be able to pull during our guided project. Helper text, error text. Questions on text fields? All right, any general questions on the components for material design? All right. Okay, so let's take a look at how we can take our wireframes, create them into high fidelity designs using specifically the material design theme. So if we head over to Figma, you will see a file that is called mobile design. And the link is also available in Slack for you to click on. And you can go ahead, awesome, just add you could go ahead and just, you could just duplicate this first board where it says example, because you all will have access to everything else here. So if you go ahead and just recreate or copy and paste these screens over, add your names, and that way you can all follow along. Oh, what is this here? All right. Awesome. So the nice thing about Figma is there is a material theme Figma kit that you can download. And this is considered a UI kit where you can come in and you can view all of the configurations that are set here. Their color theme palette is available, but if you would like to customize and use your own color palette or use other colors that are available in material design, you can come in and update it here. And that way, once you make changes to your mockup, those colors are going to reflect there as well. There's also additional colors that you can modify here, which are related to different components within material design. But this is basically going to be your library that you can refer back to. So it'll list out almost similar to your style guide. So it's listing out the color palette, the typography, which have been set as textiles already. Also different shapes. So with material design, they use a variety of different types of button sizes or shapes. So here we have a more rounded view for buttons, but these other shapes also appear within material design. Some that are more rectangular, some that are more circular. And then material design also has its own icon library. So if you are looking for an icon set, I would recommend just sticking with one, just because they're going to feel more cohesive rather than pulling from different libraries. And all of these links are available in the top right-hand corner. So if you were interested in finding more information out, you could click on the links on the top. But what we're going to do is we're going to start basically skinning all of these screens that we've created in the past. And the great thing about this kit is that everything has already been set up. So what I would do is I'm going to start moving these over into material design. And I'll just start with the sign. This is really our sign-in screen. So I'm going to start with the sign-in screen. Going to just relabel this just to keep my files clean. So this is just Android. And I'm going to take a look at what's available under assets to start skinning what we see here. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete this so I have a blank canvas. What I would also recommend is, because we're also designing in Android, if you tap A for artboards, we should be converting this to a 360 to 640. And we can just modify it, modify the artboards here. So 360 and 640, which is going to be a slightly smaller size than what we've been working with, which is an iPhone 8. Now that I have my wireframes, I can start skinning these designs. So here I have a Flutter sign-in. And if I click on these 4 dots, I'm going to have all of the existing style guides for material designs typography. A good one to start off with, let's try H5. That feels very similar to what we were working with, so we could leave it as that. Another thing that we would also want to do is add a backdrop. So if we click into assets, you're going to have all of your material design system components here. And there's a lot that's going on. So when I was taking a look at this, I was like, oh my, you know, I have to click several different layers to find things. So the easiest thing for me is actually just going into search and finding what I need. Backdrop is basically going to be what, basically your background image of the application. So searching for backdrop, there's an image here. It doesn't have anything on it. Being that this is a sign-in screen, we don't necessarily need to worry about having a navigation or an app bar on the top. So I'm going to drag this over and paste it in here. We notice a few things. One, it's covering the text. So if we actually hold down Command and the, I don't know what to call it, the bracket. Let me see if I can pull it up. Bring our shortcuts. The left-hand bracket view. Here we go. Okay, so right now, this is a really handy tool, so I would recommend, if you're unfamiliar with Figma, keep this up so it's easier to refer back to for shortcuts. But you could hold down Command, and you can hold down this little bracket guy, and what will happen is it should bring you to, it should send it to the back. Oh, let's try this. Shift Command bracket. All right, it is not working out for me. All right, or you can just manually move it to the front using the layers. But I'm not sure if it's not working because it's a component. Another case, there might be some customization that needs to be done. So here, it's not necessarily fitting towards the end of the page. So for now, I'm just going to go ahead and just attach it. Oh, this is set up with a lot of things. And I'm just going to increase the size of it. It was working for me before. All right. If you all are having trouble, you can use this.
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
Why are there so many elements for a simple rectangle?
So like for the buttons, for example?
Or yeah, just this backdrop here.
Yeah, it's the way that they've set up their layers, and I don't have a good reason for that. There might be, there's ways where you can set up your components where you'll have components within components, and that's something that they've probably done here.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so now that we've got our backdrop there, I'm also going to go ahead and add a status bar, which Material Design calls a system bar. And so I'll just start typing system bar and drag that over to the top. All right, cool. And then as we start to build this out, we do have input fields. And so if I start typing fields, let's see. Actually, if I start typing text fields, that's when we can go in and find a variety that we see here. So I'm going to use this outline for a text field. And there might be some exploration where you go in and see what works and see what doesn't work. And what I'll actually do as well is I might customize this where I can go in, double click. I can put, let's say I wanted to change this to full name. Let's say I wanted to remove the assistive text, and let's say this was optional. I wanted to remove the eyeball. We could go ahead and do that. And then we could also go in and duplicate the rest of the information here to add email and password. All right. And then we can add in our submit button. So I'll just type in button. And for now, we can drag this over and see what that would look like. And double click to enter submit. And that would just be one way that you would be able to start transferring this UI kit over to your low fidelity design to create a high fidelity so that you're able to take a look and see how it looks from there. Any questions so far?
So we don't need to do stuff manually. We can just, should have thought of that yesterday.
So the way that you have your master components set up, you should be able to go in and search for them and pull them from here and just drag.
Great. Thank you.
Sure. All right. So let's work on the third one. So we may not have time to get to this one here. I think this one's a little bit more complicated. So again, if we just tap A and click on Android, and I'm going to relabel this homepage, Android, we can start scanning this as well. So the first piece that I'll need is my system bar. So let me just add that back in. And then we see a couple of things going on. So in this Flutter app that was built by Brandon, we see that there's a profile icon. we see that there's an edit button here, or to compose. There's a different couple of ways that we could approach this. Not everything is going to translate over at 100%. So it's also being flexible when it comes to picking out a UI kit, making sure that there's enough components that are going to fill the need of the wireframes that you've put together, provided that you're moving in the direction of just using an existing UI kit. So if I start from the top here, we could add in our app bar, and we can drag over this purple one here. Is that what I want? Let's see if there's others that would fit. Okay. All right. So here we can go in and customize this to Flutter. And then what we're noticing is because there are these two icons and they don't necessarily translate here, we can customize what we see in front of us. So for example, we don't have a hamburger menu here. Maybe at this point, if we don't need a hamburger menu, this can be brought over. If it lets me, there we go. Okay, that's not going to let me. What if we do a reset instance? All right, I am going to detach it for now.
Yesterday.
This is what Ivan and I were talking about yesterday. Yeah, so I'm going to detach it for now, but I'm going to bring this over so it remains consistent with what we see here. We do not need these heart and search icons. And then one way that we can adjust for this particular design is to actually add a, if I have my terminology correct, a list to appear. So we'll do that in just a bit. The next thing that we're going to do is add a search bar. So if I go into assets and just type for search, I can find one. We can use this regular search that we can place. And then we have somewhat of a list view that we see here.
I'm not so sure what we're doing here. So you have an app that's on a different platform and you're converting it into a different one? Is that what we're doing?
So part of it is just understanding how to use UI kits to convert your low fidelity designs into high fidelity designs. And just understanding how we can leverage that when we don't have like an existing style guide in place. So material design, oh, go on.
Now it's turning a low fidelity into a high fidelity. How come the size is different for the, what do you call it? Like, why did you adjust the width of the main? My God, what do you call those things? I completely forgot.
Artboards, the frames. Yes. Yeah. So that's a great question, Nadia. So what we had originally been designing was an iPhone 8 size. Mm-hmm. I converted it over to Android just because this is material design. Mm-hmm. And also to demo how to copy these elements onto here. Mm-hmm. I could have left it as iPhone 8. I would just have to have gone in and manually adjust all of it. And that's okay too. Yeah. But just for this demo.
I'm so sorry. So all the components that you're using or accessing they've been built to fit this particular size, or are they somehow auto adjusting to what to?
I wish it could auto adjust, mm-hmm. but it doesn't do that. So this has been built for the size.
I see. So they've already been pre-built with this size in mind.
Exactly.
And you're just selecting them and putting them in. That's it.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you for example, were searched for a search bar, you saw so many. What made you choose that particular one?
Yeah, so for that particular one, I tried to make consistency between what Brandon had placed here. So there are going to be a variety of different search bars. You could have one that has a label, or there's other components here that represent when someone's actually filling in and typing the text input. So what I selected was purely just a default view that I had brought over.
Okay. Sure. Thank you.
Yeah. And what I would say is the more familiar you get with material design, I know early on I had to go back and forth between these components and back into materials design system just to make sure that I'm using them correctly. So it's not necessarily just searching and pulling and pulling them into here. There might be some back and forth to say, okay, well, search bar, I see it, but am I using it correctly? So if I were to go to material design, search, let's just use app bar for an example. So let's say I wasn't quite sure how to use an app bar. I see it. What I would do is I would take an extra step just to understand that I'm using it correctly. So that's where this design system comes in, where I can see, understand the components, understand how it should look like. There might be some do's and don'ts. And then that's when I would take a look at my inventory of components and then start dragging them over into my file. Cool. Great question. All right, so we'll continue to build this out. And the last thing that we'll do is we're going to add a list. So these are called lists in material design. Remove that. And if I just search for list, I am going to get a bunch, just like Nadia pointed out, which one do I use? So it's a matter of referring back to the document, making sure that you're using it correctly, but just also exploring and see what's going to fit. So if I were to duplicate this, I have here, Brandon has added an image, some text, some subtext. And so just by taking a look, one thing that pops out that looks very similar is this component where we have room for an image, room for the group name, and the subtext that appears below it. I could also go ahead and explore a different type of list. And maybe, I know it's a little hard to see. Let's find one that doesn't have too much going on. There's one here where it's a little bit smaller in size. There's additional iconography on the right-hand side, which I don't necessarily need to use, so I can remove it, but I could also explore and see how that would look like. So it's also just making different iterations, seeing what works, seeing how it fits within your own wireframes, and then being able to build that out.
I had a few more questions.
Sure.
So if you are making this, if you're making this version for a different platform, how come you're not referring to an original high fidelity design so that you could be consistent with the colors and the shapes? You see how your submit button is completely different. So I'm surprised you're building off a low fidelity design rather than, I mean, if you were doing it like for the first time, if this was your first version, then that would make sense. But if you are trying to make it cross-platform, then you should have a high fidelity design to pull off from. That way you don't have to decide whether you need to have that heart there in the list or not, because all of the designs would either have them or not have them.
Yeah, so I'm basing this off of as if I had no no style guide or no design system in place, and I just purely had wireframes, and I needed to convert them to high fidelity.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I
Okay.
should have clarified that earlier.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. All right. Other questions about UI kits and theming this material design that I can answer? All right. I know we're getting close to time. So I'm happy to put this together and share it with you all so that we have another example to look at. So let's take a look at the assignment. Your assignment is going to be in Training Kit. So under mobile design, project, and for our assignment, continue to use your Build Week project as part of your afternoon assignment. And so to better understand material design and how to use UI kits, I ask that you just convert 2 of your wireframes, 2 of your existing screens, and just use the material design theme. So it can be desktop, it can be mobile. Just pick out 2 screens just so you can get the experience of translating them into material design. And then the second piece here is finish building out your mobile screens for your Build Week project. If you did not start with mobile first, then finish building out your desktop screens. As deliverables, make sure that you have a link to this 2 screens with the material design theming applied and a link to your Figma board showcasing your new screens. And then as a stretch goal, depending on which platform you've already completed, just start building out the other ones. And just remember that your Build Week project is a web app experience. And then these are just reminders. We don't have to go into further detail, but things that we should be staying on top of so that way you're all prepared for Build Week. And then if we take a look at the rubric, so rubric meeting a 2, at least student theme 2 of their, I will change this, 2 of their screens, because I know not everyone has mobile, and that they followed the material design guidelines when applying the theme to their mobile screen. So basically what we just did for our guided project. And then this I will adjust as well because not everyone may have mobile screens, but just making sure that the screens that you've developed for today follow your user flow and meets MVP. And then the spacing and file format and attention to detail has remained the same. So we'll continue to make sure that everything is spaced and aligned correctly, that your file is organized, and that there's no spelling or grammatical errors in your work. Questions on the assignment?
So Melissa, for material design, it's always going to be Android, right?
It is always going to be. So material design is unique where it's mainly used for Android applications, but if you take a look at, it also can be used for websites and web applications. iOS cannot.
Great, thanks.
Sure. Other questions? Okay. So I know we haven't had a chance to do the daily UIs in the last couple of days. So I would love to review a couple of designs. For those of you who need to jump off and would like to head to lunch, feel free to jump off. For those of you who are interested in getting design critiques and feedback on your daily UI, you are free to stay on. So feel free to jump off or stay on. I did want to make sure that I dedicated some time to daily UIs. All right. So I am going to pull some from yesterday. And is JP on? All right, I see ya. Cool. All right, so I am going to ask the same 2 questions. What's going to be a little bit different is when I ask you what would you change, if you could refer to the visual design feedback, that would be a great starting place. And let me just add that into the Slack channel. Okay. All right. So GP, what do you love and what would you change?
Well, I'd probably change maybe the boldness of the full name, email, password, choose account type. I feel like it's not as because if you were to look at basic account info, it doesn't feel as bold as the field of the. I'll probably change that.
Cool.
Another thing I would change is probably the color of choosing a producer or a listener. A listener, I think it's supposed to like probably change the color of orange to maybe white, possibly. I like because before I posted this, I had the pagination bar up top, but then I changed it to the bottom because I felt like if it was at the top, you wouldn't really know what's going on. So I changed it to the bottom. So when someone is to click next, they know exactly what's happening with the pagination bar, like going a little bit more than it's supposed to. So I think that's all I would say currently.
Okay. All right. So I would say I agree with what you've pointed out. One thing that I might change is I notice under choose account type, you have these listed out as basically like these full width buttons. And so when I was looking at this for the first time, I almost thought that these were like our next and cancel buttons rather than you actually requesting a specific account type. So what I was really visualizing, and this is something to play around with, is actually using, I think material design calls them selectors, selection controls. So I don't know if there's a good example, but basically something like this where you're able to select one or the other. Whereas this almost feels like the way that the buttons are used is that there's an action that I can take place.
All right, I see your point. That's actually a good idea to implement. So like checkbox.
So a checkbox would allow you to select multiple items, and it would be this what they call
radio
radio
buttons.
Yeah,
radio buttons.
Cool. All right, JP, thank you for letting me take a look at your work.
Of course.
And then let's go with one more. Navia, I'm going to have yours up here. So tell me what you love. What would you change based on the visual design rubric?
It seems very blurry. I don't know if
yeah, and maybe the way that it was exported, but yeah, we can ignore the blur and just focus on the other things.
I'm not so sure.
Okay, that's no problem. That is no problem.
There's not much on there. I think I could just play around with spacing a little bit more so that enter email and create password seem a little crammed. So I would maybe increase the font size a little bit just so that it's easier to read. Maybe that. And I feel like the distance between the logo and the first field could be maybe increased more so the fields are a bit further down from the logo. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Navia. So one thing that comes to mind that I see here is just related to the spacing that you're referring to, more so around the spacing between all of these text inputs. So this is a very clean design. It's very simple. I would just bring these closer to one another just because to me, this level of proximity, because they're very far apart, I feel like they're not related. So just bringing these closer would change your design and make it feel more cohesive.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. All right. Awesome. All right. So I have provided feedback on 2. Is there anyone that would like to volunteer and show their work that I can provide a design critique on?
You can pull any of mine if you'd like.
Oh, Serena speaking? Okay. Let's see. Great. Okay, so tell me what you love about this and what you would change based on the visual design rubric. Oh, and Serena, I don't know if you're on mute.
Sorry.
Okay.
I love that all the key information is really bold and large. For me as a traveler, I hate any boarding pass that doesn't show me my terminal and gate immediately. And I really like this, the complementary colors that I chose of the purple and the yellow. It's very Laker-esque right now, but I do like that. And then I also very much focused on having a large QR code, because I don't know if anybody else experienced when you're boarding and the scanner just sucks. You're like holding up the line. I thought that focusing on the QR code as well was very important. What I would change, there's some negative space between boarding time and seat number. And then above seat number, that is a little awkward, and I was trying to play with that. I'm not sure how I would fix that, but I would change that. And then there's also negative space to the right of gate, but I kind of feel like that is also a good thing, because to me that is very important, and having some space around it is still good to have. So I'm kind of like flippy floppy between that.
Yeah. So regarding this top area where you have all this negative space here, I think what you have here, you basically have text that is left aligned, that is easy to read. So I like the way that this is structured here, because it's just easy to read. The colors that you use has enough contrast. And I'm wondering, you're talking about the amount of space here. I'm wondering if there's a way that we can keep it aligned with the terminal and gate that might reduce all this extra space that you see here. So maybe pushing that in and seeing what that could look like. And then I agree with you with QR codes. But then another piece that also stands out is, if I'm looking at the little details here, one thing that points out is this airplane icon, which doesn't necessarily seem aligned. It feels like it's more closer to this top section of the header. So maybe just aligning that as well. And then, is this the default arrow that is in Figma?
Yep. Okay.
So I would recommend with that, just use an icon for that. What I've seen in some work is using the default arrow, or actually typing the word X to close out, which I know is not here, it's a bit disruptive to the screen, to the experience. So I would just recommend finding an icon that actually represents an arrow itself, and to not use this default.
Okay.
Cool. But yeah, I really like the color scheme that you have here.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Serena. Okay. All right. So thanks for those of you that stayed on. Appreciate it. And I know I'm not always able to get to everyone. So what I would recommend is, if you would like feedback, just add a little blurb to yours as well, and just say, hey, I'm looking for feedback. And then that way we'll have other team members join in and they could share their feedback as well. All right. Anything else that I can answer before we all hop off? Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your lunch, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.